Great. Hello, thanks for coming to my talk. I thought, I don't know, given it's the third day and almost last session, a lot of people would have already gone home to try to catch a train or something. So thank you very much. My name is Dr. Lisa Andreevna Chalaguine or Chalaguine, depending on where you're from. And my talk today is based on my last research paper that I published doing my PhD, which was in 2021 when I published that paper. 2022 was when I got my PhD. But I sprinkled some ChatGPT magic on it, and I was accepted for PyCon this year. And yeah, so before we start, who am I? I'm many things, but what is important for you to know for this talk is that I have a PhD in computer science from University College London. My supervisor was Anthony Hunter, so shout out to him. Without him, this all would have not happened. And the topic of my PhD was conversational agents with persuasive capabilities using natural language. So basically chatbots that tried to change your mind. And no, but I do not work for a Russian bot farm or anything. But I get that question a lot. Anyway, so as I said, this talk was based on my last paper, which I presented in 3 years ago at the European Conference on Symbolic and Quantitative Approaches to Reasoning with Uncertainty in Prague. And what I did basically is that I took some of the chats from that study, which I'm going to present in a second, and simulated those dialogues using ChatGPT. And then now that I don't have funding anymore, I self-funded my study. I crowdsourced some participants and I gave them those dialogues, like the old ones, the original ones, as well as the ones generated with ChatGPT, and asked them to assess how convincing they find the responses from the digital healthcare provider, and checked, which chats had a higher score. And I'll present you the results in the end. Cool, so here are my previous publications. You can find me on Google Scholar, so I don't want to delve too much into, computational argumentation, and it's a bit of a niche subject. But if you're interested, you can check out the publications, and also, of course, check out my supervisor, Anthony Hunter. However, still, given that this is a PyCon and not some, niche conference on that topic, I will quickly talk about computational argumentation. So it emerged in the early 90s as a knowledge representation and reasoning paradigm. And then back then it subsumed many of the then existing formalisms for non-monotonic reasoning. So it emerged from logic. However, during the years, it has evolved into a research field with applications in quite a few domains in AI. Such as decision-making, multi-agent systems. Basically, what I'm also talking about, right, is an agent system. Natural language processing, obviously, because arguments, well, they consist of language. Although you can also treat them as atomic if you're just, creating like a formal argument graph and you want to assess some strategies. But now, obviously, NLP is a big field as well. And other disciplines. So regarding COVID-19, you could argue that it's also a bit of healthcare, and then of course legal reasoning, given that legal reasoning is all about arguments, which side is wrong, right or wrong. And however, from an NLP perspective, the main research fields are mining arguments from text, so basically detecting arguments in, for example, in legal text, assessing properties of arguments, and of course generating arguments. Cool. Argument graphs. So if you think of a chatbot, right, in order for the chatbot to give you responses, as I said, this is all prior to ChatGPT, so we're talking now expert system. A chatbot needs to be aware of the arguments of both parties, right? So it needs to be aware of the arguments that a user might potentially give, given its natural language. It's not just some menu where they can click, but the user has the freedom to input free text. And in order to give an appropriate counter-argument, right, it needs to be aware of the arguments that the user gives, and these can be represented as a directed graph, right? So you have the user arguments and then the chatbot arguments, and then so these would be the nodes, and then the edges would be the relationships between them. So for example, this argument attacks that one, and then you have another one which might defeat the previous one, etc. So these we call argument graphs. And these arguments need to be crowdsourced to reflect the user's reasons, right? Like we need to go out and do a bit of like, I don't know, research. Why do people for example, don't want to get the COVID-19 vaccine? The acquisition of the chatbots arguments depends on the domain. I had like a previous studies where we like crowdsourced those as well. Obviously for such a sensitive topic like COVID-19, we didn't want to crowdsource the counter arguments. Like these needed to be like kind of drafted from a healthcare professional. So yeah, why crowdsourcing? So again, be aware pre-ChatGPT. Because first of all, not all reasons might actually be presented in the literature, right? And then language varies, right? For example, formal versus informal. So here's a little example. You know, when I back in the days Googled why do people not take the vaccine, you know, you would find like articles that say there've been a few reports circulating online about people who didn't get vaccinated. They were generally healthy and didn't think they were susceptible to COVID-19. Whereas if you ask a person, they would just say, well, I'm young and I have no pre-existing conditions, so I'll be fine, yeah? So obviously, they kind of say the same thing, but expressed in very different ways. Also, it's just really easy to collect a lot of data in a short amount of time. There are a lot of platforms like Amazon Mechanical Turk. I personally was using Prolific. So yeah, that's why crowdsourcing. And then what we did is we did something we call automated concern labeling. So basically what we've noticed, and again, we didn't know that, we just, we got the data and then we were observing, and we've noticed that actually like people give like, there was a very limited number of reasons why people don't want to get the COVID-19 vaccine. Like the main ones were like side effects, long-term side effects, and that the development was rushed. Right, after that, like people, well, I mean, there were some who were worried about, you know, Bill Gates' chip and things like that. And then you also had, unfortunately, also just like fake news, like, you know, like women being concerned about infertility and things like that. But mainly, people gave like, kind of like, you know, the same arguments. And so we clustered them based on, you know, common words and synonyms, etc. So here you see an example for fast development. Like this is a couple of examples how people expressed their worry about the fast development of the vaccine. And they were then all labeled with with the label fast development. So here's a little example of what we call a concern argument graph. So as I said, because we've noticed that people's arguments were so simple, we decided to actually literally just use the concern and not a whole argument in the graph. I'll explain in a second what other possibilities there are. So here you see the chatbot stance, right? The chatbot stance obviously is I want you to get the vaccine, and I want you to. So it's not. So there are different types of arguments, right? It's not a two-sided argument. So it's not like the chatbot tries to convince you to get it, and the user tries to convince the chatbot to not get it, right? It's just a chatbot being like the authority, trying to convince the user that he or she should get the COVID-19 vaccine, and the user doesn't really try to convince the chatbot to do anything. So it's not, for example, an example would be if we can't decide where we go for dinner, right? And like I give the arguments for this restaurant and you start giving me arguments for the other restaurant. This is not happening here. The user kind of just like agrees or gives a counter argument. So you see the concerns here, fast development of the vaccine, possible short-term side effects of the vaccine as a second concern. The initial concern graph, or concern argument graph, consisted of 7 concerns, and so basically like 7 nodes, around the chatbot stance, and each was equipped with like 2 to 4 counter arguments, which we created with our colleague from the digital health department. So again, it was not just me sucking them out of my fingers and making up arguments, like they were checked by a healthcare professional. That they're valid and don't say anything wrong. And these were our hypotheses. So just maybe going back to the slide. So we had previous studies, where basically the first layer of the graph was also arguments, and we tried, using like similarity measurements, to match, like to find a similar argument. We've noticed that in this domain, this will not be necessary, that you can literally just classify the concern of an argument because they're all so kind of simple, instead of using some sort of like cosine similarity or whatever. So this is why in this case, we used a classifier. I'll talk about that in a second, whereas in previous studies, we would actually use a similarity measurement to measure the similarity between the user input and something that we already have in the graph in order to retrieve the appropriate counter-argument. So these were hypotheses. Our first one was given a novel domain, a small set of arguments between 30 and 50 can be used to represent most of the possible arguments that a set of normal users would know, and appropriate counter-arguments can be utilized by a chatbot to create persuasive dialogue. So meaning, again, we didn't go back months later and checked whether he or she actually got it. I'm just talking about the stance, so you ask about the stance before the chat, and after the chat we were not capable to monitor whether the person actually got it. Given a novel domain, the arguments that address the same concerns are sufficiently similar to allow for the provision of suitable counter-arguments just by identifying the concern of the argument. So this is what I was talking about, that we just like train a classifier on those texts, on those short texts, and that just by identifying the the concern, we can provide an appropriate counter-argument. And then, of course, we also had to check, does it actually matter whether we use a chatbot or a static website? I mean, you could also argue just present all the arguments on a static website, screw it, with all the chatbot development and hosting and whatever, just let the users read them. Also, we were interested in whether during the chats new concerns would be identified, right? Because like crowdsourcing and just asking, hey, give me a few reasons why I don't want to get it is different than actually being in a dialogue, right? Where people can go deeper or can think of something else that they don't think about initially when they just asked, to fill in a form. So we were kind of doing it in batches. So we would recruit, let's say 60 participants and then analyze those chats, see whether we find something new. And so basically we made the chatbot smarter and smarter. This is why I said that our initial concern argument graph consisted of 7, but then towards the end we had around 20 concerns. And each one, again, equipped with some counter arguments. So we recruited 300 people. Unfortunately, in the UK, there is a law that you need to, or at least at UCL, there's a rule that you need to pay people a certain amount. So because of that, it's always a bit limited in how many people you get, because you can't just exploit them and pay them nothing. Or very little, let's say it like that. So we recruited 300 people who indicated in a preliminary survey that they are very unlikely, somewhat unlikely, or neither likely or unlikely would get a vaccine. So obviously we didn't recruit any who said, oh no, of course I would get it, because that would be just cheating and there's no point. 240 of them chatted with the bot, 60 were presented a static website. Because we didn't want to waste too many resources to, we want to check, hey, is the chatbot more persuasive? Yes, cool, and then continue with the study. So first they were directed to a form, asked how likely they would get the vaccine, then chat with the bot or read the arguments, and then asked again about their stance. The chatbot was equipped with very simple, because we didn't have that much data, if you think about it. We know for NLP we need a lot of data, so that deep learning models, to use them starts making sense. So we just used simple bag-of-word, logistic regression, old school, good old scikit-learn code as the chatbot's backend. And when a user argument came in, it identified the concern, and then according the concern picked the counter argument. If the concern was not identified, we used something called a default argument. But if you think about it, this also happens in an unnatural conversation. If I can't counter you anymore, I need to come up with something else. I'd be like, okay, but, so it's not really unnatural. This is also what we do. We do not continue going deeper and deeper, one counter argument, this one counters that one, and the next one counters this one as well. Very rarely we do that for more than a couple of, let's call it dialogue moves, right? At some point we run out of counter arguments for this one and we move on to something else. So the chatbot would kind of be like, okay, fair enough, but have you considered this? And basically this would be if the chatbot cannot identify anything, then this was our backup. And then once all the arguments ran out, the chatbot would end the chat, and that's it. And as I said, the concern argument graph was extended after each batch of around 60 participants to add more concerns and counter arguments to the bot. So here's a little example. So I know the text is really small, but basically here the person says, I'm scared of side effects. So the chatbot would know, well, the concern is side effects. And then it tells you something like, yes, short-term side effects like high temperature and flu-like symptoms are not pleasant. However, Then, so what we've noticed, right, is now that in this specific domain, it doesn't happen in other domains, but for this specific domain, because back then people were not that educated yet, right? It was a new virus, people were worried, but they weren't apart from some people who spent a lot of time on Twitter, not everybody became an expert on COVID-19. There were those people, as you know. We also recently got a lot of experts on Eastern European politics. So it depends on the Israel-Palestine conflict. So every time something like this happens, there will be experts. But of course now this is a chat, let's say of a average normal decent person. And so what we noticed, so jokes aside, what we've noticed is that they would basically not counter, they would just come up with a new one. It's like, oh, but then I'm worried about this. And so this is what you see here. Oh, but we don't know what will happen in the long term. Then the chatbot again provides a counter argument. And then the person says, it's anecdotal evidence, my friend's mother got the vaccine but still got COVID, okay. So this one was later added as a concern, but it was an initial concern. So the chatbot couldn't identify it, and the default argument here was, despite that, if enough people get vaccinated to achieve herd immunity, we can finally go back to normal life. We'll be able to travel, go out, meet friends, etc. So this is a little example. So here are the results. Again, I don't want to bore you with numbers too much, but basically, this is just the breakdown of participant stance before and after chatting with the bot. And you see that some people changed, their mind from a negative stance to a positive, like somewhat likely and very likely. And a total of 20% of the 240 participants actually changed their stance to the positive after chatting with the bot, not to the negative. I've had studies where some people change it to the negative because we started annoying them on purpose. That was like one of the groups we wanted to check. But here, people either just, the stance remained as before the chat, or it changed to the positive. Table 4, so breakdown of getting a COVID vaccine of the group of 60 participants before chatting with the chatbot and the group of 60 participants who present a static web page, just to show you that they were more or less similar. Because otherwise you would introduce, right, bias if the people who look, for example, at the web page are way more on, like, if the percentage here basically is way higher, right? Because you basically have people who are less reluctant to get the vaccine, and then basically we needed those groups to be more or less the same regarding, the willingness to vaccinate. And we can see that for the web page, that there were some people who changed from negative to neutral, but nobody changed to positive, whereas the chatbot was more successful, and so we continued with our study because we decided that probably chatbot is a bit more engaging and entertaining and more likely to change people's stance. So, contribution. Well, we've shown for this specific domain, where there is a lot of uncertainty, that a small argument graph can be used to represent most of the possible arguments in this domain, and actually, and the chatbot can be utilized. Again, as you know, no solution fits all, but even if, let's say, 1 million people talk to such a chatbot, and even if, just a couple of thousand change their stance to the positive, I mean, that's already an achievement. We presented a method how to acquire and structure such a graph. And we demonstrated it is enough to identify the concern, as I said, and instead of using like some sort of similarity measurements. And we've shown that an interactive chatbot has a higher persuasive effect than a static web page. Limitations, of course, arguments is not the sole medium of persuasion, right? What a lot of people want is actually just information, so they will ask questions. So this chatbot couldn't answer questions. So this was just purely, argumentative. So yeah. That's why you could argue that the setting is quite restrictive. So what I want to say though is that we addressed that. So a master's student did actually build a QA component using BERT in 2022 when I was working there as a lecturer. However, well, we didn't have funding. Master students don't get funding, so this chatbot was never used. I didn't have any proper dialogues. We had some test dialogues, but we didn't have dialogues from an actual study that I could use for simulation. So this is why the dialogues from my study were used. Okay, so here's a little demo, which now magically started working. Anyway, so you see, I just screen recorded my mobile. It was hosted on one of the servers at UCL. And so here I'm typing in, hey, I'm worried about side effects. And the chatbot would reply, sure. So what I already read out earlier, short-term side effects like high temperature, flu-like symptoms are not pleasant, however, much better than getting COVID. Duh. But what about long-term side effects? And I mean, a lot of chats literally looked exactly like that, more or less. Like, people are worried about side effects. Next time, the next argument would always be long-term side effects. Chatbot would again reply something, and so on. There will be a link of the GitHub repo, by the way, and the animations there as well. So if you want, the chatbot is not hosted online anymore. However, the whole code is there, all the arguments are there, and this little demo. So I don't want to. So I know that the probably a lot of you don't see it very well anyway because the font is really small. So, comparison to ChatGPT. This is where the interesting part starts. So as I said, not completely randomly, but basically I picked some dialogues that were a bit longer. I didn't pick dialogues where people gave very specific arguments and the chatbot just used the 3 default arguments and the chat was done. Obviously I used the ones that were a bit longer. So I picked 10 and prompted ChatGPT with please give a short argumentative reply to the following argument why someone does not want to take the COVID-19 vaccine. And you saw now, hopefully, why that worked, because quite often the arguments were not interconnected. So people would give the side effect argument, and then the next one would be the long-term side effect argument, and they weren't really connected. So the chats actually still make perfect sense. Crowdsourced 100 participants for each dialogue, so in total there were 20 dialogues, right? 10 ChatGPT and 10 originals, and for each, and the participants were different for each individual chat, and I just asked them to please rate the overall convincingness of the arguments given by the healthcare chatbot, from not convincing to very convincing, 1 to 5. Well, and the results were that the expert system got a high average score than ChatGPT. So only 2 dialogues were rated as more convincing, but I mean, to be fair, I mean, 3.63 and 3.38. I mean, it's not like one was super non-convincing, the other one was super convincing. I mean, you can see they're more or less the same. So maybe if, I don't know, I had recruited 1,000 participants or, even more, maybe it would have changed a bit. But what I'm saying is that what I expected actually that the discrepancy would be higher, that like ChatGPT would be better and that it would be higher than the expert system, because of course there were places where the user said, that's not what I said, like this is not the question I asked. So there was like the users were not always super happy. But I don't know, in general, the expert system still did quite well apparently. So maybe there's still hope for some expert systems to survive. Anyway, conclusion. So ChatGPT definitely is better than providing long, elaborative answers. That's why I also had to use that prompt, because if you just say, I don't want to get the vaccine because because of the side effects, it gives you like, a massive message with 10,000 different arguments on why you should get it. But I wanted to simulate like a chatbot setting. Obviously, ChatGPT does not require concern classification. ChatGPT can reply to a vast majority of different inputs, right, like arguments, questions, etc. So we don't need like, I don't know, different strategies for each form of user input. However, it would be worth digging deeper why most of the chats of the expert system were viewed as more convincing. Like I didn't ask for any reasons, right? I was just asking, please rate it. But by the way, there were attention checks, just FYI. I know that it's because you could argue people maybe just quickly wanted to get paid and clicked something. There were attention checks. Don't worry, I'm a good researcher. I'm not good at many things, but I'm good at that. But yeah, it would be worth actually then also asking, hey, why do you think so? And like giving people to compare. Like here you see 2 chats where the users say exactly the same thing, but the chatbot replies different ones. Why do you think one is more convincing than the other? And that's it. So all the code, all the data, all in my GitHub repo. That's my email. That's me. So what I do, I mean, never wrong to advertise yourself a bit. So I create teaching content, Python, Intro to ML, Intro to Time Series, Intro to Data Analysis, in German, English, Russian. If you want to hire me, you need to be quick. If you want me to be responsive in CET time, I'm only here until September, and then I will be in GMT +7. Yeah, hence the 10. Cool, any questions?
Let's send Lisa. Okay. I'll try to ask the questions in the microphone, so they're recorded, and there are a couple of questions in Slido. So one question is kind of asking, isn't it kind of expected that domain-adapted chatbots will always be better than generic chatbots?
I guess in general, yes, but given, as you saw, this one was quite primitive with, as I said, the initial argument graph only had like literally 7 concerns, and so 7 times on average 3, so 21 arguments. I mean, I found it a bit surprising. I mean, this is quite a restrictive setting. So I agree if this was like an amazing, elaborative domain expert system, but this was, it was like a little PhD project with not a lot of funding. So I generally think for this for this easy of a solution, I was surprised. But on the other hand, I'm a big fan of easy solutions. So always try something easy. So if a simple bag of word model works, why bother, deploying like some deep learning model and like getting GPUs and whatever. But I don't know, it depends, right? It's some clients, might not like it because it's not, bag of words doesn't sound sexy, but LLM does.
Okay. Also, another question about the expert bot. Did you only try to convince people through presenting scientific facts, or did you try also communication tricks?
Only scientific facts in this one, yeah. Like no tricks. I know what you mean, and actually a fellow colleague of mine at the University of Alberta, he tried different methods. He tried scientific facts, so he had a chatbot for scientific facts, and then he had a chatbot that tried anecdotal evidence, because it's like more empathetic, like, yeah, a friend of mine, almost died and then got the vaccine and was like magically saved. Like, yeah, so there have been studies that have done that, but this one was just, it was quite scientific and, yeah, just factful.
Okay, do you have any thoughts about mixing the the two systems? So an expert system and ChatGPT, how would it look like? Yeah, what are your thoughts?
I mean, I'm all up for it, right? But I'm up for also proper testing and not just, I don't know, making it for the sake of making and then deploying it and hoping for the best. But no, I mean, obviously that's the way to go, like combining simple solutions with more advanced ones. So you could think that, for all those simple arguments, I'm worried about the side effects. Then maybe just use, the pre-scripted answers that you've maybe tested on on certain populations and they just worked. And then if somebody says something more specific, then you can always, instead of using default arguments, then you can, use ChatGPT to answer that.
Yes, we have a couple of more questions and time. So how was the convincingness of the chats quantized for the comparison between the GPT and the expert system?
Yeah, okay, so as I said, so it was literally just Google Forms, and they were presented a dialogue, and then the question was, please rate the overall convincingness of the arguments given by the healthcare chatbot. Yeah, so it was like user, chatbot, and yeah, and they just had to rate whether they found them overall not convincing or very convincing. Like I wouldn't ask for like rate each individual argument, right? It was like the overall chat.
And this also goes kind of in the same line, and the reviewers did not know which...
No, they wouldn't. Okay. No, of course they wouldn't. No. Like they had no clue about anything. It was literally just, hey, now that the topic's not sensitive anymore, we're doing like a follow-up study. Okay. We're comparing to different systems. They had no clue that one was an expert system, the other one was ChatGPT. And the demographics was because some of the arguments mentioned the NHS. So the only prerequisite was speaking English and living on UK territory. That's it.
And so how did you recruit?
Prolific.com.
Okay.
Or .ai, I think, yeah.
And did you keep any kind of statistics or information about the participants?
I should be able to find it.
Okay.
But I'm not sure where. I'll need to check because like I wasn't interested. I'm not sure that if I don't specifically say it, whether they reveal that information, okay. Because that all of a sudden I would get too much information from the participants. It's all like strictly anonymous. So I'm not sure whether, I think you can only see that what you clicked, if you see what I mean. Like I'm not sure they would tell me all of a sudden also their gender and whatever. I would need to check. Okay,
so you kind of looked at the entire pool of subjects as kind of, one pool with one distribution. Yeah. Okay. Mm-hmm. Let's see
if you haven't heard of Prolific, I highly recommend it. Like, check it out. They give you a lot of options for like custom screeners and yeah, like what sort of like demographics you want. I mean, it's pretty cool. I started using them a while ago where they weren't that advanced yet. So now I use them after a very long time again. I was pleasantly surprised. But because I think it's either from the University of Oxford or Cambridge, I can't remember. So it's a UK-based company, I don't know. And yeah, they're quite strict with payments and stuff like that. Yeah, so they will be much more expensive than Amazon Mechanical Turk, right? Because like they need you to pay the participants a certain amount, and they check the time it took. So you can't just say, oh, it will take them 3 minutes to do that. If they see at actual participants, in order to, when they clicked on the study until submission, it took them 20. Yeah, then you will be flagged, and they might, suspend your account. So yeah, be careful. But apart from that, it's really good.
Okay, and I think a question may be a short one. Who had the last word in the conversation? Will it end after an answer from the chatbot or after a comment from the user?
That's a very good point. So it would ask with it would end with the user, because then the chatbot ran out, right? And then the chatbot would just say, okay, thank you very much for your time, blah. But I always deleted that one because there was no answer for that, right? So that one would always be deleted. So in the chat, the user would say the last thing, and then chatbot just thanks you and sends you on your way to get the vaccine. Whereas for the evaluation, that last one I deleted. So yeah, good point.
Okay. Let's thank again Lisa, and so you don't have much more conference to talk with her if you still have questions. I'm sorry I couldn't get to all of your questions, but maybe she'll be available.
I'm around, yeah. I'll also be on stage, you'll recognize me.
Yeah.
I'm also an organizer.
Very well. Thank you for all your great work in organizing and giving this talk. And we'll start the next one in 4 minutes.